Welcome to more Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. My name is Jamal Bynum. I'm the chair of the board, and we bring in from time to time different people to share different ideals that will help advance anti-racism and race equity in our society. And again, that's been a big issue in the recent years, more so in the last few years, on the national as well as local levels. So in the program today, we have Jack Dunn, who's one of the founding members of Policy Research and Innovation, which is now known as MORE. This nonprofit started about 12 years ago in his home. He's been involved in other progressive organizations over the years, dealing with increasing working class folks into challenging systems and issues related to that. Jack has authored a number of papers and articles and so on that deals with tax increment finance. He got a lot of support from different people, and individuals borrowed some of his ideas and concept. And again, tax increment finance has given Omaha a lot of cannon fire to deal with twisting the laws to benefit corporations and some of the elite local government interests instead of grass tops and grassroots in our community or the underclass. I invited Jack to talk more about his papers, and also in one of his treaties, he talked about the managerial class, which I found fascinating. And I want to talk a little about that and the buffer elites, and also how can we help deal with real issues. He will share some of how that is constructed, as well as some of his observations about our class system. And again, all this is related to more and race issues in our respective community. So on that note, Jack, can you share a little bit more with the listening or viewing audience, a little bit about yourself?
There's so much different history. For instance, I spent a good deal of my time as a mature adult as a psychotherapist. However, I also in the past have had a first-class electronic or radio engineer license. I used to repair video cameras and players. I worked with a group for a couple of years that produced videos in Madison, Wisconsin for the public access channel back in the days when there still were such things as public access channels. It had a magazine format news program. Anyhow, I am interested in a lot of different things. I sometimes describe my interest as Catholic with a small c, meaning universal. I grew up working class, serious working class. My dad worked on the railroad. He did not have an office job. He went from brakeman to conductor over his 35-year life at the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he was a fierce union supporter. I mean that literally. He would get into fist fights if there was ever a picket line with scabs who were trying to cross the line. My mother was a secretary. She was very proud of the fact, and rightfully so, that she worked on the one of the major bridges across the Cuyahoga River, the Lorain Carnegie Bridge, back when that was going up. When my mother did not work during my early childhood. I think it was probably when I was in 5th or 6th grade when she went back to work. And I've always wondered what people are thinking of when they talk about how back in the 40s and 50s, someone working could make enough money to support a family of 4. We had great difficulty supporting a family of 3. I was one of those miracles of Irish Catholicism, an only child. But part of what that meant was that I was able to, or they were able to send me to a decent high school when it came that time. At least they thought it was a good high school. It was run by the Jesuits, very modeled on the same plan as our local Creighton Prep. And I went there for 4 years with a little help from the high school. And graduated from there. That might be about it, other than both of my parents were very class conscious. And that may sound strange because usually people in the professional managerial class don't think of working people being class conscious, but as a matter of fact, my parents certainly were. They were quite aware of the distinctions between the judges, the lawyers, the teachers, and so forth, and regular working stiffs. One of the examples of the whole family being involved in unions is that my uncle Jim was an officer in the local Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen union, and when the BRT called a strike, the Pennsylvania Railroad naturally got a judge to issue an injunction. The problem that they ran into was that they had to find someone to deliver it to. They had to find someone official to deliver it to. My Uncle Jim's hid out with my parents for about a week until the Pennsylvania Railroad finally gave up and said, okay, we'll deal. So that gives you a sense of where I come from.
Good. Now, in the article that you shared, and I've had a chance to deconstruct and read it, I want you to share a bit more on what is meant by the managerial class. And oftentimes in the article, it says they were one of the greatest buffer for forward movement. And again, oftentimes buffer for those who are stuck at the bottom of our socioeconomic system. First, what you mean by, number one, managerial class, and then give me a little bit of overview of why this managerial class, who are defined as educated, professional, lawyers, journalists, and artists, and so on, are the buffers for people at the bottom.
That generally means people with at least a college education, if not beyond. It especially means people who are in management positions, although it can also be easily applied to teachers, lawyers, those kinds of social science folks. And the fact that they constitute a class is a relatively new phenomenon in human history. The only society that comes close to that, in my understanding, it was Mandarin China, where you had to be a member of the Mandarin group, and they would pick people from throughout society, as long as they were talented and ambitious and so forth, to join that society of Mandarins, which ended up running the country for a long time. Mm-hmm. In this country, it was a bit different in that when the nation was founded, there were very few professionals of any kind, and most managers were people who actually owned the business and worked in that business with their employees. So there was much quicker feedback about what the employees might be thinking or feeling. As a matter of fact, I believe it was in the 1800s, a number of European visitors commented on the fact that in the United States, there were so few professionals that a person could actually just read a couple of relevant books, hang out a shingle, and become a doctor, lawyer, pharmacist, veterinarian, whatever, as long as they sounded like they knew what they were talking about and actually could produce some results. Nobody usually questioned them, especially the further west you went.
You know, it sounds like today we got people who hang out a shingle and say things and don't go anywhere and do anything. Now, in the article, you talk about professional managerial class, and I saw they use the abbreviation of PMC, and they also said that they're roughly 28% of the population. Is that high from your vantage point? It's almost like we got a significant number of people in that class who are not accessible to help people at the bottom.
That's true, and there's a distinction that needs to be made, or at least we need to be aware of, that there are a number of people, especially scientists and others who work in the hard sciences, who are professionals, and they respect their own professional calling and ethics and so forth. That tends to be a little slipperier when you get into the social sciences, and especially into government and high corporate areas. There are professionals and managers there, but in the corporate sphere, they work exclusively, usually for the corporation and for helping the corporation maximize profits.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
In the government area, it's trickier. We have seen excellent examples of professionals in government who refused to betray their trust. For instance, in Georgia, where the elections official there refused to go out and find a couple thousand more votes for Mr. Trump. That was an excellent example of someone whose politics are by no means left, but who had a sense of professionalism, who wasn't going to betray the trust that he had. Not going to betray the office that he had in trust for the people of Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the African American community, Malcolm X used the term the field and the House Negro as a metaphor for folks who don't have necessarily the interests of those who are at the bottom. Is there a similar picture if we make it racialized for other racial groups in terms of image? So use the word managerial class. We call them the House Negro in the sense, meaning they're in the house protecting their bosses, versus the field Negro, according to Malcolm, they're out in the field with the masses fighting against oppression. Would that be a good equivalation, or let's say not the word balance, or some type of metaphor for that group from your vantage point?
It is in many ways, although it turns out that many of the people who are opposing the ruling class are also from the professional managerial class. The problems come in the fact that members of the professional managerial class have little understanding or empathy towards working people. And although they will fight for changes and improvements that benefit themselves or their class, they tend to not be as eager to jump on the bandwagon for working class issues.
Wow. Well, it reminds me when I was in Baltimore at a conference and I had a white colleague who was in the field described to me some of his in-laws and relatives who were white and they were poor, as they say, as a church mouse. And he said they voted for the supported Trump mentality. And he was going on and on about how they didn't know their own interests and they were voting for this millionaire, whoever, billionaire. And it was already, slated what Trump was going to do before he got really fully into office and some of his behaviors. And so my point is that sometimes people vote against their interests because they don't know better or they've been brainwashed or duped by the status quo. So again, those who are in key positions are going to throw down money at you if you're part of the underclass. It was kind of an interesting thing. You shared this article. Go ahead. Sorry.
There are a segment of society that is like that. My own take on the Trump phenomenon is that there are quite a few people who are just shut out of the system. And they've been lied to and manipulated and talked down to by those in charge, especially Democrats, for so long that they just said, now forget it. Let's just burn the whole thing down.
Right. Kind of much more of a radical approach. Now, in the article you shared by Barbara and John Allwright, you wrote that the real story, they say, behind the crash and burn is a managerial class. This was an alternate. In short, they shared basically that millionaires like to include themselves as a middle class, and they use example of Mitt Romney, who's worth like $21.6 million as middle class. Talk to me about these millionaires who try to play themselves as part of the working class or the middle class when they're that rich or in the top 1%.
There are some millionaires and billionaires who worry about the opinions of the rabble, if you want to call them, the rest of us who are not billionaires and billionaires. And the problem is that there's getting to be fewer and fewer of those people who actually worry about what the people think. And going back to that line I mentioned a minute ago, the regular people have been talked down to and lied to and manipulated and so forth for so long that they're really not very eager to continue accepting what comes down from the top.
Right. And also I share with that over the years, I've written to a lot of elected officials, particularly Omaha Plantation School Board members, and you'd be surprised how many have never responded to the correspondence we pay our property tax on time and they support the schools, but they really don't engage the community because they see themselves as part of that managerial class that they got to keep the natives or their families in line and not challenge their educational system that hasn't produced the results that they talk about. Excuse me. How do you find various class? Go ahead. Sorry.
I would claim that most of the training especially in graduate school, but even in college, is for how to be part of the professional managerial class. And a good part of that is a shared disdain for the working class.
So Jack, you're saying that colleges and universities are turning our young students and people against their own interest groups or their own communities and so on, in the sense where you put that?
Well, especially the elite colleges and universities. Yes, it's a little more mixed with public schools, the local schools and so forth. But especially on the elite end, if a person comes in there with a working class background, there's a huge jump, cultural jump. I can attest to this myself when I got to Madison, Wisconsin, coming from rural Ohio. And I ran into people who talked about, or who asked, "Oh, where did you summer?" They used summer as a verb. And my reaction, of course, was, "Oh, I summered in my backyard." But this is the difference in culture, lifestyles, income, net worth, whatever, that working class people will run into when they hit college. And it's a big jump. It's very scary.
As you mentioned, I remember hearing some young students who were enrolled in some of the local Catholic high schools that were extremely elite and expensive. And they said the teacher asked a question, like after they came back from summer break, what do they do? And they had to deal with their class difference of some of their students who went off to Europe and other places for holidays, and they basically had to do their summer jobs. And so this particular student says they were so embarrassed by that question because it was obviously came from a working class family that barely made it into that expensive elite Catholic school. So again, I know that feeling from just those individuals.
And there's quite a bit of pressure to conform to that elite understanding of reality then, because they seem to have it all. And,
and they're bourgeois in a sense. They can, they get away with stuff because the system protects and support them. Even our justice system illustrates if you got money, you oftentimes don't have to do the time, even though you get slapped on the wrist. And again, all you gotta do is look at the numbers of African Americans and Latino, brown and black folks in prison and jails and system to know that we get the worst end of the stick, as Malcolm talked about.
Right.
Another piece that you shared with me was an article, Democrats for a Disability, or I'm not quite sure, attack the Democratic Party as basically useless because they're similar to the Republican Party during current times. Why are some progressive attacking, as they would say, the party of hope in this time of Trumpism? And Trump has had a tremendous impact on the social and political discourse, and particularly African Americans and Latinos in this country. So why do you, or that article, the author, go after the Democrats with such strength or such power, saying that they're basically useless?
Well, it's interesting. The person who wrote that phrase and that article is a class traitor. He is an extremely intelligent, extremely well-read person who can come up with some very odd and unusual references. It means, if I remember my French correctly, it means Democrats caught sort of half undressed.
The pants down.
Right, there you go. And then I got so caught up in trying to remember that fact that I've lost what you've asked.
Well, basically what I was saying is why is he attacking the Democrats when some people see the Democrats as a party of hope? I mean, he came at them strong in his article that they're not doing their job and they're basic compromisers and they're trying to be elites themselves. The party.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that particular individual still considered the Democrats to at one time have been a party of hope. And I suppose maybe during FDR they were for a brief period of time. But ever since at least 1968, when the liberal contingent nominated Herbert Humphrey to be their presidential candidate, the Democrat Party has been taken over by professional managerial class people. They have little use for labor unions. They'll listen to labor unions with one ear and the other ear off to find out what their consultants are telling them about the next election and who they have to woo with the big bucks to be able to finance the next election. The Democrat Party is a party of, I don't even want to say failed hope. It's an illusion. They're kidding the whole world. They are not the party of hope at all. Now, there may be one or two exceptions to that rule. I hold out some hope for AOC, for instance. There's a few like that. Bernie has a lot of good ideas and never seems to be able to get them to go anywhere.
Right. Petty business owners in the African American Chicago community see themselves as successful when government or structures stack the odds, against them or help them with some income, so on. And my question somewhat is, when you look at some of the private negotiations and issues that traditional white corporate class have in this city and elsewhere, how can these new emerging brown and black organizations compete when things are stacked against them? In other words, I find it ironic how they want to be petty bourgeois or capitalists, but the money they throw at them is so small. Can they really do anything being a small minority in a big fish? It's like me competing against Walmart with a few dollars thrown at me from some government grant or whatever. So how do you define that process, or how can you explain that whole issue of race and class and government interference to help people who are at the bottom?
If you follow especially the mass media, the commercial media, you'll find marvelous stories of individual success, of people who have fought the odds and bucked the currents and made it on their own. And the number of those, when the entire population is taken into account, is so small that it's almost laughable.
Right.
In my opinion, the only way that people of color or working class people are going to survive is by talking to each other, listening to each other, beginning to support each other on different issues, partly governmentally and partly on the shop floor. Like when there's a strike by Starbucks workers, helping hold up picket signs, making sure you don't go in when they're on strike, things like that.
You mentioned that. I find it ironic that our systems almost condition people to do the divide and rule. Years ago, there was an African student who we knew at the medical center, and I think we saw him somewhere, and he said something like, "Plek, you don't know me." I mean, I've seen people do that elsewhere where they're so afraid of talking to group members because of the racism and inherent elitism of these institutions. They don't know each other. I even talked to some of the so-called Black professors at UNO who've been working there for years, don't even know their own African-American colleagues because they live in their own enclaves. They associate only with their hobnobbing friends in their department, if they call them friends. And at the end of the day, there's not that unity, which you can look at the curriculum and everything out there, that they're not doing any massive organization for our community. Another thing that came up to mind is when Omaha is known for its great racial divide. I mean, it's been segregated for years. It's apartheid city, Blacks live, African Americans live in North, Latinos, Chicanos live in South, whites live in West, and never twain shall they meet, as they say. And you will find a few sprinklings living in other parts of town, different groups. But for the most part, we've lived in a segregated environment. And my question is that this income divide is very great. Billionaires and millionaires are here. What are the best ways to affect those issues? And also, some say the tax system is broken. How do we deal with the tax system? So how do we deal with income distribution is one. And then number one, how do we deal with this tax system? Because it's obvious it favors the elite to have all these write-offs and things they get credit for than you having another child. So talk to me about a great income divide, but also the tax system.
Under current conditions in the current situation, it's I was going to say it's not possible to do anything, but of course I don't really believe that. It's very difficult, and especially doing things according to the book. What needs to happen is to stop doing things by the book, and joining together with other people in similar situations of whatever color, creed, race, whatever, and beginning to share stories, building up relationships, because relationships are what move any movement. Those are the important things to do. How do people? I think you were asking, how do people make it in the society? I'm the wrong person to ask. I never did quite make it in this society, and I watch other people and I think, oh, okay, that was their choice. But it's very difficult, and without connecting with others in similar situations, wherever you work, wherever you go to church, whatever clubs you belong to, talking about the difficulties of being not only successful, but surviving in the current situation, and sharing stories. Those are the ways that people begin to get organized. And of course, organized effort is what's required.
In more movement, I'm off for race equity, our organization, nonprofit, we oftentimes talk about addressing anti-racism and race equity, which I will say emphatically there are very few, if any, organizations that have that in their mission statement in Omaha, Nebraska, particularly Nebraska. Often when you speak, you focus, Jack, on class issues. I mean, and you've been very clear about that for years. And my question somewhat is that you folks, that can there be a bridge between one considers historical racism embedded in this country and sometimes the lower income white folks who are stuck in a poverty or class system for generations? And when you say generations, I'm alluding also to the people who may grew up in Kentucky or in East Omaha who've had poor families for generations and never made it out of their squalor or their situation. So can we ever have a bridge between low income whites and people of color, particularly African Americans in the United States as we presently are?
I believe so, absolutely. I think all that needs to happen is for both low-income whites and low-income blacks to begin to talk to each other. And one of the things they'll find is the humanity on each side of the equation and the similar situations that they are all in. And as they come up, as they recognize this, they will begin to think of ways that maybe they could improve each other's lots. And this gets difficult, of course, because the whites have such a bad history of, I won't use curse words, but of really messing over Black people when it's in their interest. That has to stop. But again, that's only, Black people will only listen to white people who are talking about improving Black people's lots if the white people are straightforward and actually walk the walk and not just talk the talk.
Right. Well spoken, because I know very few who are what we call anti-racist in terms of their behaviors and actions, and oftentimes they don't want to give up their white privilege, and so you see these smug personalities in these positions, quiet as a church mouse. When they hear and see things, they whisper or they ignore it when they know it's blatantly wrong. You oftentimes use the term socialist, and you use it very freely. What does that really mean? Because I hear people using the word socialist as a pejorative term, but I also hear people using it as a term of endearment. And also religious people use it to talk, Jesus Christ was a socialist, to those who believe in Christ or Jesus or their religion. So talk to me, what is a socialist?
Well, again, the ruling class in the United States has done an excellent job of making socialist just another cuss word. It has very little meaning behind it. But what that usually means is a situation where people who work for a living have at least have equal say with those who don't have to work for a living. And that's another word for that is democracy.
Right.
And democracy is a phantasm in the United States just because of those unequal money situations.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you for that, because I think too often it's very clouded. We're getting close to the end of our time, Jack, and I know it's been interesting how you share these insights, particularly the work that you've done over the years to deal with progressive and more and elsewhere to do that. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to share with our viewing audience?
I have one thing that particularly irked me, and it may be my failing that I am able to come up with things that I get annoyed at quicker than things that I think are wonderful. But there's a there's a book by the name of 1619 by Nicole Hannah Jones, who is a sterling example of how the ruling class brings up people of color to try to undermine any kind of connections between whites and blacks. She wrote an essay called 1619, saying that we should really count the founding of the United States being 1619, because that's when the first African slaves arrived. Everything in, it's very hard to find one true statement in her essay. Several Black historians were asked to participate in that project. They refused. And trying to remember, another factor is said on that essay is it only mentions Martin Luther King, for instance, in the caption of a picture about Martin Luther King. How he can have a history of Black people that doesn't really mention Martin Luther King, and that certainly has no mention whatsoever of Malcolm X, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, various other individuals like that.
Jack, are you saying she excluded them in that book and her essays? There's none of that mention of any of these prominent people in our culture?
Absolutely. The essay is available on the New York Times website, or at least it used to be, and I'm sure it's floating around somewhere. I have a copy. If you do a word search for those names, nothing, zero, zip.
Which is sad if that's the case, as we say in our culture and our history. Our culture is made up of so many different people who contribute to the struggle, and oftentimes we ignore Fannie Lou Hamer and Ida B. Wells and some of the women.
Absolutely.
Some of them, and so oftentimes when people eclipse or they provide these synopses of African American history, they pick their favorite parts and they stay with them. I haven't read the book. I've heard a lot of the controversy about it, but I'm always nervous when someone is in a position where there's not a lot of input. So again, I can't comment on it, but again, it's the thing that we use for public discourse, just like the Whoopi Goldberg thing. We got to deconstruct that onion and that elephant to really get to the essence of what we're really talking about, because too often we sensationalize one or two misquotes or somebody misspoke, and then we want to throw them under the bus instead of using it as a teaching, learning experience of dealing with racial reconciliation and just having the conversation. So yeah, we need to explore that a little bit more as we move forward, but really appreciate you sharing that, Jack.
And
any other thing you want to share before we leave?
Well, in building on that, that is a standard operating procedure of the ruling class, the oligarchy, whatever, that they will search for and in their eyes, hopefully find people from minority groups, from the working class, even, that they can hire to keep things quiet, to keep a lid on things, to misdirect, mislead, have people go in bad directions, in useless directions, and so forth. And there's quite a bit of that thing going on even in Omaha. I don't think I need to mention any names, but there are quite a few where there's a number of the Black misleadership in Omaha that it would fall into that same category. I don't need to go into that because I'm white, and that's something that Black people should go into, but it's there.
Well, Jack, I appreciate you on that note sharing that, because I do think one of our challenges that we need to sometimes deconstruct the buffers, the collaborators, and the elites, and particularly at the end of the day, I hear people sit in a room and sing songs to each other about how good it is. But if you look at the demographics, if you look at the information, things have gotten worse. And so, as Malcolm X used to say, instead of being the American dream for many African Americans in this country, it's American nightmare. Again, we cannot define people's experiences unless they define it themselves. So on that note, I really appreciate Jack Dunn being on this program of More, Speaking Truth to Power. and more than anything, throwing down some heavy light. So looking
And I
forward to
appreciate the
other-
opportunity.
Thank you, Jack. Appreciate it. Take care. Broco.
You too.